We're going to jump in. We have a really tight presentation that we think will kind of really lay some things out for you pretty clearly. And then we want to spend a lot of time in dialogue with all of you. And so please, welcome any questions. Feel free to interrupt us, but certainly know that this presentation is not going to go the whole time. We intentionally designed it to go quick so that we can spend time in discussion with all of you. We can start talking a little bit about what we want to cover. I think one of the things, our very first slide, is really highlighting for you all that there has been a community broadband task force that Christy mentioned that really kicked off in April earlier this year. Feels like it's been a couple years with COVID, but really co-convened by the Columbus Foundation and Columbus Metropolitan Library to really focus on broadband activity and digital inequity in our community. The task force continues to grow. We welcome new members, actually, even this morning, but it includes representatives, a couple of which are on this call, Karen from Jewish Family Services and Christy from the YWCA, the partnership, Franklin County, AECOM, Columbus State, CODA, Columbus City Schools, MORPC, really a cross-section of leaders who are really interested in identifying opportunities to close the digital divide in Columbus and really Franklin County. Autumn will say, and I think Sam and Angela will agree, that, as we have looked at other task forces across the country that are also using COVID as inspiration to try to solve this digital divide, we are pretty fortunate, again, that we have this task force. It has been a very informal but incredibly effective group. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that the task force has accomplished so far. I don't know if we're making progress on the slides because I can just keep going. Yay, nay. I apologize, you guys can't see these slides. We'll make sure you get them. But, first, we say the digital divide, and that said differently and may mean something different to a couple different folks, depending on who you ask. But we do have a slide for you all, just so you have it for reference, that really defines the digital divide. And I'll read a little bit of it just because you all can't see it. But a digital divide is an economic and social inequality in the access to, the use of, the impact of information and communication technology. So this divide within countries, which also you all will note is not unique to America, but certainly is something we see across our nation, may refer to the inequalities between individuals, households, businesses, or geographic areas, usually at different socioeconomic levels or other demographic categories. So the divide between different countries, regions of the world is referred to as the global digital divide. And that's examining the technological gap between developing and developed countries on an international scale. So this is a broad topic that, has really, unfortunately, become a way of life for us in America. We recognize the internet as something pretty essential. Many are now calling the internet the fourth utility, and it's surprisingly unavailable, largely unaffordable for many American households, and particularly citizens here in Columbus and Central Ohio. So for those of us who have it, we can't imagine life or the impacts of not having access, right? So there are a lot of things that we do on our phone. We order our groceries, we text our kids, we send an email from our phone. There are all these parts of life that are really commonplace to us, but you all should know and hear us clearly today that the digital divide persists in a very significant way in Columbus and Franklin County, and that's something that we really want to focus on. But just note that digital divide, while a lot of our task force work has focused on household level access, also impacts businesses in other parts of our community as well. So again, you guys imagine that you're looking at these slides of different news articles. Christy highlighted that the digital divide was here long before COVID. It's been studied from an academic research perspective for 20, 25 years. COVID certainly shone a light in a way that really showed us as a community, I think even locally, that we were woefully unprepared for this moment, but it's not new. So as with many diversity and inclusion issues we face, COVID really, really made the impact of this inadequate access visible and real for our most important citizens in the spring, our students. So when we were abruptly disrupted, that impact was very, very clear. students across the country, including our neighborhoods here in Columbus, couldn't connect to school. They couldn't learn when schools went remote in March, and there was significant impact to them. And so that was really the impetus, again, for the task force to form, and this work has really blossom. So COVID is not the beginning of this problem, but it certainly brought attention on a national scale. And I think we all should be grateful. There are many gifts, as painful as 2020 has been, there are many gifts in these moments of awakening. And we think one of those gifts is really an opportunity to focus on the digital divide. So again, I just want to underscore that the digital divide is not new. This is a problem that has existed since the beginning of commercial internet, which Sam tells us is in 1994. Governments, nonprofits, and the private sector have made attempts to close the divide. And while successful in narrowing the gap in many cases, a universal solution to the problem at its current scale remains elusive. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. You should also know that it's not unique to Columbus, the county, or even our region. We're not alone in addressing this issue. Many urban cities and especially rural counties across the nation are working to close the digital divide. But this work does not happen fast. It's not easy. It's certainly not inexpensive, and it will not come without significant challenges, which we'll share with you some of those barriers later. I will note for you finally that it's not business as usual. So this closing of the digital divide is largely going to be reliant on changes in public policy, some at the federal, the state, and the local level. And I hope we'll get in some discussion about that as well. The formation of public-private partnerships. We've got a really great start with our task force, and local, state, and national investments in broadband are needed to address the problem at its current scale. Before I turn it over to Sam to really help you all understand what the word broadband actually means, I will note for you that if you would have asked me personally on January 1st, if PACT and Wexner Medical Center would be focused on helping households on the Near East Side get access to the internet, I would have looked at you with a confused face. And I give you that note because I don't think you have to be an expert. And I always share this with people in this dialogue. You do not have to be an expert in this work to make impact. And I really believe that as we've gotten to this point now, and this recognition that the internet is a platform for life, it's all of our work. So it's not just the Sams, it's not just the Angelas. All of us have a role to play in this and an opportunity to add value. So I'll turn it over to Sam, who can talk a little bit more about broadband. And hopefully that was a good introduction. And I'll come back in a bit and share exactly what we're doing on the Near East Side.
So thank you, Autumn, and we're still working to get the slides online. Certainly apologize for that, but in the interest of time, we're going to keep going. And so as Autumn really just talked a lot about what the digital divide is, I really want to shift to talk about what it means from a household point of view and from a technology point of view. What really is broadband? And put simply, broadband is just a way that we send information to back and forth between two different points in the forms of zeros and ones, and we do that over copper or fiber optic cable or over radios or transmitters. And if you've ever used a light switch in your lifetime, you really know how broadband works. When you turn the light on, that's a 1, and when you turn it off, it's a 0. And we call those bits. And if you turn the light switch on and off 8 times, that's what we call a byte. And a byte is the basic number of bits that forms a 0 or character, like a letter in the alphabet. And so it takes 8 bytes to send that information across the internet. And when we measure the speed of broadband, we measure it in terms of the number of zeros and ones or bits that are communicated per second from one point to the next. So 1 million bits per second is a megabit, or about 125,000 numbers or characters. And what's interesting about this communication technology, as Autumn really mentioned before, the commercial internet really started around 1994, but we've been doing broadband communication in our country and around the globe really since the 1960s. And that technology over the last 60 years has really changed. Technology in general has changed. I'm an older guy, but if you think back 60 years, I grew up and saw the invention of the color television, the personal computer, then the internet, the smartphone, and now the Ring doorbell. Much of this is due to the development of the semiconductor and the rapid technology change that it has also happened in broadband communication as well. The technology continues to evolve. In 1981, when the personal computer was essentially first invented, we were communicating back and forth around 300 bits per second. But with the change of technology, those speeds are increasing. And in fact, in 2019, the FCC defined high-speed broadband communication as 25 megabits or 25 million bits per second down and 3 million bits per second up. We've already seen the commercial definition of high-speed internet change even just since 2019. And so when you look in the commercial marketplace for home residential connectivity, the starting point of the conversation, awesome. The starting point of the conversation, I'm going to stop for just a second, folks. If you could just advance to slide 7. Right there. Great. Thanks. So really just since 2019, it's already changed. And so if you went into the residential marketplace today, the starting point of the conversation is 100 megabits per second. And often residential households are buying a billion bits per second, which is known as a gigabit. And we expect these speeds to continue to change over our lifetimes and our children's lifetimes. 65 gigabits per second is likely in the next 10 years. And I'm going to shift here in a moment and talk a little bit about the drivers for this. But the point here is that when we think about the digital divide, solving the availability and the cost problem is not a one-time phenomenon. And the reason for that is that every time we solve it, the technology changes. So we really need a long-term and a permanent solution as long as the technology keeps changing. If you go to the next slide. So what's changed is that, I talked about the one TV per household metaphor. Really in the 1980s and through the early 1990s, due to the cost of personal computers, we really only had one computer per household. But think about what's happened. The cost of televisions have come down. The cost of smartphones has come down. The cost of personal computers have come down. And so now we don't just have one TV or one personal computer in our house. We have multiple televisions. Everybody has a cell phone, multiple computers in the house. And what's more, all these devices work together. So when you think about being able to use YouTube on your smart television, you can also watch the same video on your smartphone or your laptop. And what's more, they're all connected together. So you can send and receive text messages on all your devices all at one time. So we've really kind of built an ecosystem around us. And that's true not just for mom or dad, but also our children as well. So a lot more devices in our households. And then on top of that, there's some major changes going on in technology where we've entered the machine era, and the machine era is about taking devices or sensors. If you've heard of the phrase the Internet of Things, it's about putting machines on the internet, and those machines can be on our person, so a smartwatch or a fitness tracker is an example of a medical device that we wear. Video cameras in our homes like Ring doorbells or garage door sensors or security systems are examples of sensors that go in our homes. And we're also putting sensors in our businesses and in other areas as well. So with all these these machines that are going to be added to the internet, the need for more and more connectivity will continue to increase over the foreseeable near future. Next slide, please. So when we start to think about what that connectivity standard needs to look like, one of the things that we talk about a lot is that everyone, and especially those that are disadvantaged the most, should have the same speeds that the rest of us have. The table in the lower right-hand corner of this screen are actual recommendations from the Federal Communications Commission around the bandwidth that you need to do remote education or remote telework. You'll see there in the lower right-hand corner that for a student, they're recommending between 5 and 25 megabits per second. And for mom and dad that telecommute, they need 5 to 25 megabits per second. So in a family of 4, you need between 20 and 100 megabits a second during COVID and the pandemic if we're all at home doing remote telework. And so this in large part is why we're generally recommending higher speeds than the current FCC definition of high speed. We're generally recommending that it needs to be 50 megabits per second at a minimum, and it should grow from there over time as the technology continues to change. We go on to the next slide. So Autumn really defined the digital divide, and I really kind of described that it's about broadband connectivity. But what really explains why some people have it and others do not? So back to Autumn.
Thanks, Sam. We need our own TV show. We're doing this well. And I promise you all, Angela's the expert that's going to hop in here soon. But these are what we would call kind of primary causes and factors that explain why we have the digital divide. So the first one being the availability of it. Can I buy it, right? This is a service. So building broadband infrastructure is not cheap. Fiber optic cables, radio transmitters, cell phone towers, all of those things just sound expensive, right? Broadband providers have typically invested in areas where they have the best chance on return on investment. So where they know that they will have customers who can pay for the service, that's where they have historically placed their investments, largely in the highest population areas, large cities. So what we see is in rural America, where the geography is bigger and there are fewer people, there has been less of a broadband investment. But even I would say availability in urban neighborhoods, and we can go down a rabbit hole there. It may be there, but it's probably not as modern or as well maintained as some other portions of our city. And you all can probably likely guess how to draw that on a map if you wanted to. The second component and cause that we think about are extremely important to consider is affordability. So it's not just does the network exist, does the broadband provider exist, but can households at all income levels afford a subscription? Is it affordable? When you look at residential internet bills in your family cell phone plan and add the two together, you'll get your family's broadband budget. If you think about it, for a family of 4, for most households, that broadband budget is a category that won't be your highest expense. That's probably your mortgage, your cars, your insurance. But overall, broadband is pretty expensive. It's one of the highest bills that you pay. So to put that simply, while it's available, low-income families primarily don't have the income to afford broadband. It cannot fit in their budget. And so when you're facing the choice between connectivity and a cell phone, they choose a cell phone. Why? Because they work at jobs where they need to be mobile and they have to be able to connect with their employer and to be able to do so on the go. So they can use their cell phone hotspot, and that leaves broadband access to their house as one of those things that they don't prioritize in their budget because it's just not affordable. The final thing, and I would argue, and we'll talk about this some more in our discussion, is digital literacy. Do households have skills necessary today? So Sam touched on the fact that the internet has evolved and will continue to evolve. But imagine, and some of you have clients who, as I would describe, have navigated their whole life historically around the internet. They don't really know what it is or how to use it, and helping them understand the benefit as part of adopting the internet in their home is just as important as giving them the tools to do that. So I will just note again, literacy is a continuum. So there are some people who have some digital literacy skills, and there are some who have none. And if you ask them, they'll tell you they don't think that they need it. Next slide, please. So I shared that, if you would have asked me on January 1st if I would be at all working in this space and supporting our community, I would have really questioned that. And really our work at PACT on the Near East Side really launched in March as a result of COVID. So we're one of those organizations that, we decided that this was a space that we needed to give strategic focus in. I would be remiss if I didn't note that, we on a whim, and many of you are fundraisers, and I would love to learn some of those skill sets. I am not a fundraiser, right? I literally woke up and had programming halted because of COVID-19. And so we had to figure out how to add something that wasn't in our budget to support the community that we serve. So we entered the Big Give. We worked with the Columbus Foundation. We also benefited from funding from the City of Columbus's City County Resilience Fund, to do some device distribution, which I'll talk about in a moment. But we stood up pretty quickly this as a strategic priority for our neighborhood, and really have decided that by 2025, the 8,000 households that we serve on the Near East Side will no longer be experiencing the digital divide. I say very strongly that the internet is not a luxury. It's a required utility for life. And so if you don't remember anything I say, just really, I hope that resonates with you, and we'll talk a little bit more about the why. You can go to the next slide. So one of the things we did, and some of my text is missing here, I'm sorry about that, but two things. One, we did a residential survey. So we'll share again that a huge part of this is not just pulling the data that Sam and Angela and I can easily pull from resources like the American Community Survey, but actually engaging the residents that we're trying to serve. And so over the summer, with some support from the Columbus Foundation, we actually hired neighborhood residents to go door to door wearing PPE with iPads to interview households. We talked to more than 300 households on the Near East Side to really get a sense of, what barriers they were facing, what they might want to use the internet for if they had devices, and really to gauge what their understanding was. So the primary devices in our households were laptops. I'll tell you, and I'm happy to share more about this survey if there's interest. What we learned were two things, and one that did not surprise me was the number one reason why people do not adopt service is obviously not because it's not available, it's the cost. So we asked people an open-ended question in our community and said, on average, most of our internet service providers offer a low-income plan that's about $49.95 a month. Is that affordable to you? And if not, what number would be? On average, our residents told us that about $25 or less would be affordable in their household budget. Affordability is really, really important to closing the digital divide. And so I knew that would be an important question to ask. The other questions that we asked were about their uses. So again, this happened over the summer, and so people were preparing to return kids to school virtually. And so we asked them what their concerns were, and we got a lot of great data. One piece of data that came back from the survey that surprised me, but it really is continuing to guide the way we approach literacy, is that people share with us that they had a fear of the internet. Crazy things, weird things happen. But to me, that really says that they don't navigate it often, so they're not comfortable with it. And so a huge part of our work and the way we're trying to pursue literacy is to make people confident in participating. Again, the internet, this digital society is not going away anytime soon. And certainly some of the new tools that we've used during COVID will probably stay on. And so we really want to give our residents the dignity and access of participating in society. And that's really the way that we're thinking about the internet. So I think I'm turning it back to Sam to talk a little bit more about the availability. Next slide.
So Autumn did a really good job of describing the three main causal factors, and the digital literacy outreach is such an important component for connecting to the community. And she gave some very real examples of affordability. I'm going to share pretty quickly some slides just to try to drive the point home for both availability and affordability visually. And again, remember, you're going to get these slides after the presentation. So when you think about the availability question, is it available in my neighborhood? Our best records in the country are from the Federal Communications Commission, who has basically been inventorying broadband access for many years. And what you're seeing on the screen is the national fixed broadband deployment map. And the dark colors are the areas of the country that have 4 or more providers that meet the definition of 25 megabits per second down and 3 up, which is the current definition of high speed. You can start to see the lighter areas, and you might imagine those are more rural parts of the country. Next slide, please. And we start to look at this at an Ohio level. If you just think about where the people are located in Ohio, you can see that same color distribution. We can see there in Franklin County, you start to see the really dark areas. That's saying that there are 4 more providers of 25 megabit service in those very dark colored areas. And if you look north up to Cleveland and up to Toledo and down toward Cincinnati, you can see that the large urban densities, as we said earlier, that tends to be where broadband providers invest because that's where the highest population density is. And then in Appalachian Ohio and Southeast Ohio, where there's fewer people, there's fewer providers. And you can see the exact same thing on the right-hand side. So a lot of availability in Franklin County around at least 4 more broadband providers in Franklin County. If we can go on to the next slide. So we're going to bridge real quickly. And what you're seeing on the left, this is American Community Survey data. This comes from the Census Bureau in 2017. And what you're seeing on the right is an American Community Survey in 2018, direct surveys among homeowners and residential citizens around their consumption of the internet. And on the right side, the very light colors represent areas of the county where less than 7.7% of the homes in that area do not have internet residential broadband access. The very dark colors, 34 to 60% of those households in those areas do not have residential broadband access according to the survey in those areas of the county. And so you can just very quickly see the left side is the median household income. The lighter colors are the highest income. The darkest colors are the lowest income. You can see by census tract a pretty direct visual correlation between median household income on the left and broadband adoption on the right. Next slide, please. This is exactly the same data. The difference is the slide now on the left is households in poverty. The darkest colors are households with 42 to 72% of the households in poverty. The lightest colors are less than 6.6% of the households in poverty. Again, a direct visual correlation between poverty and residential broadband adoption. You go to the next slide, please. These are now on the left-hand side food SNAP benefits or food stamps. The darkest colors are households that receive 50 to 76% of the households receive food stamps. The lightest colors less than 8%. Again, a direct correlation between SNAP benefits and residential broadband adoption on the right. Next slide, please. This is unemployment rate in 2019. Again, darkest color is the highest unemployment rate, a direct correlation between unemployment and residential broadband adoption on the right. So it seems pretty clear, and Angela is going to talk here in a moment about the AECOM report, but between Angela's work and this data and what Angela is going to talk about, it seems to us that there is an affordability problem in Columbus and Central Ohio. Next slide, please. And this is really my last slide before I turn it over to Angela. This is a little bit dated, but Autumn talked a bit ago about a family's broadband budget. And really, broadband isn't just what's in your house, it's also what's in your pocket. And if we combine those two bills, we get our family's broadband budget. And what we did is we built a financial index, and we essentially looked at that broadband budget in the context of disposable and total household income. The chart on the left is a high property valuation, high median property valuation census tract in Northwest Franklin County, and the one on the right is in South Linden. And what that is essentially saying is that the broadband budget for a family of 4 is 2.2% of the family on the left's disposable income, or 1.92% of the family's disposable or total income. But for that same family of 4 on the right side, it's nearly 9% of their disposable income and almost 10% of their total income. So relatively speaking, it's less affordable for the family on the right side. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Angela. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Sam. Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be with you all. I was thrilled when this task force got organized in April. I run the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. I was one of the founders. We created it 6 years ago. And I was always the person saying, well, there's not much going on in Columbus, but there's all these other things going on around the country. All of the work NDIA does is national, but now there's a lot going on in Columbus, and this is super exciting that this task force exists, that so much work is happening, and that you all are talking about this issue. Next slide, please. So when the task force got started, it was at the same time that the Columbus Foundation had asked AECOM to create this report that was focused on broadband access and giving us this really astounding statistic that in many of our Columbus neighborhoods, we have at least 31%, sometimes as high as 58% of households that don't have internet access. And again, as Sam and Autumn have already explained, this doesn't mean the internet isn't available to them. The lines are there, the possibility is there, but for the most part, folks just can't afford it. The report itself, yeah, no, that's okay. Broadband gap affordability, we all get it. Next slide. The report itself got into short-term, medium-term, long-term, and thus the task force has gone at it in the same kind of way, which I think is brilliant. Next slide, please. Let's get into those. So that short-term one, and I should mention that the task force didn't operate as okay, everybody makes a decision together, but rather because there was so much energy around this issue in Columbus, there was different efforts going on at the same time, and the role of the task force was to make sure folks weren't stepping on each other or duplicating efforts. And that definitely happened on the calls, which we were having weekly for a while there. So the work that MORPC was doing and that the school system was doing was to make sure that the students had access in their homes, and so that was coming up with contracts with internet service providers to make sure that it was either a hotspot or some other kind of solution. PCs for People, that was also a hotspot solution, but it was also the devices, because not all of the schools in Central Ohio have a one-to-one program. Moving on to the next slide, please. This one has a lot of text on it because Sam made the slides. So yes, I'm going to blame Sam. So this medium-term solution is really the brilliance that is occurring right now in partnership with multiple entities within this task force, really anchored by the city, this idea that we're going to figure out how to get internet to these homes. And it may not be just paying for what's already there. That's what we have to figure out. So that medium-term solution was, what might that look like? So there's a lot of throwing ideas around and people, heading back different directions. But the big point to make, I think, is that, NDIA, through my professional, like the job I do nationally, we're seeing this around the country. So it's not just here in Columbus. We're seeing folks who are like, look, we have to solve this affordability problem. How are we going to solve the affordability problem? Well, it might be through technology, right? It might be through actually building another solution. And that's what we're seeing right now. Next slide. Okay, Autumn, back to you.
Sure. So as Angela mentioned, the AECOM report really outlined a couple of really interesting short, medium, and long-term opportunities for us as a region. I don't know, I'm getting some feedback noise, sorry about that. I don't know if somebody can maybe mute or what's going on, sorry about that. But so, the two pilot locations that have been narrowed down are the South Side and the Near East Side, so the PAC neighborhood. But what I will say to you is that closing the digital divide and the way that we're approaching it, one, there's a huge opportunity to do that if you focus one neighborhood at a time. And so that could be some thought for us as a city and a region, is that we focused on neighborhoods at a time. Coincidentally, PACT is an organization focused every day on one neighborhood. And so that's the way that we would naturally approach our work. I will tell you that has put us in a really advantageous position because we already really know the residents that we're serving. So we have a relationship and a bond to the people in our neighborhood, and we know that community very well. So I'll just note that for you to consider as you all think about ways that we can be more resilient in this space, that it probably is at a neighborhood level. With support from the Columbus Foundation, we did another kind of deep dive engineering study of just the PAC neighborhood. So Angela described to you that AECOM did this countywide study. We also had them do one of just the PAC neighborhood, which is about 800 acres, nearly the size of downtown Columbus. So not a small neighborhood, a pretty large area. And what that study was really designed to do was exactly what Angela described: identify new technologies that we could introduce into the market. And so part of that is that maybe something new will be cheaper, right? So the core point of this is that we have plenty of providers in Central Ohio. We do not have plenty of affordable ones. And so as we think about closing the digital divide, these are the three areas, the three streams that the way that we're approaching our work, but I would argue that everybody on our task force agrees that all of these things have to be happening at the same time. So number one for us at PACT, our first goal is that every household has affordable and effective broadband. So Sam talked a little bit about recommended speeds by the FCC. Some of our internet service provider speeds are too slow for a kid to be at home in an online classroom and a mom to be on a Zoom work meeting. And so I will tell you all, and maybe you're like me, prior to this year, I didn't even know who my internet provider was at home. That's my husband's department. As long as the computer turns on, that's all about what I cared. And so, now I'm really thinking consciously around making sure that our residents have affordable and effective broadband for whatever they need to do, whether it's education, workforce, telehealth, or even social benefit. So the ability to use Zoom and LinkedIn and Facebook and watch Hulu and Netflix marathons, all of that is of value to every family in Central Ohio. The second piece is devices. So we're using our city county resilience fund to purchase iPads with keyboards, 3 years of Apple Care, a case, a book bag, and a pencil for our residents in our neighborhood. And we're leveraging digital flagship at Ohio State. So we have OSU students who are going to help our residents really get started with it, all the way to coding. So we're leveraging a different relationship in addition to Columbus Metropolitan Library and other providers. And so that is one example of that digital literacy. So again, three things that have to be addressed at the same time: affordable broadband, devices, and digital literacy. But importantly, the ability to get people to adopt the internet is not something that we're going to be able to do with money alone. And so it's going to take sincere engagement, long-term engagement to really prove value to people. Again, I shared with you that we heard in our survey that there is some fear and mistrust, some safety online, and frankly, people are navigating their lives around the internet. So while funding and really making this a strategic and financial priority for our region, that's very important. The other piece is that we need the people, the helpers that are going to really help folks adopt the internet and then do it confidently with different digital literacy tools. And I think it's back to you, Angela.
Yes, next slide, please. So the long-term solutions, this is in progress, right? The big things to know about those long-term solutions is that they'll need to be more systemic. We need to look at budgets. Where's the money going to come from to pay for everything that Autumn just described? Because not only does that work need to happen in the PAC neighborhood, it needs to happen in all the neighborhoods. What is the regulatory environment? This is both local, state, and federal. So we have to figure out how we can get at all of those. One of the things that the task force is doing now is putting together a draft plan, right? And setting these big kind of pieces to it, just as Autumn and Sam have already gone through, getting at the affordable home broadband, the digital literacy, the devices. In the digital inclusion space, it's often referred to as the three legs of the stool, that we have to have all those pieces, and we can't just address one and think that the others are just going to follow along behind. We have to be intentional about them. Next slide, please. Okay, so part of my role here is to tell you the awesomeness that's happening other places so we can be more awesome than those other places. So here's who we can learn from. San Antonio. The city of San Antonio, it has investing in using their fiber network to provide internet access to students. And they are doing it only to students. This is a very unique model. And they are doing it only to students because they have a state law that keeps them from providing it to any low-income family. So that is, it's a way for them to start to get into it and show the need. And then my high hopes are that it would then extend beyond those students because, you know, neighborhoods aren't made up just of students. And then the city of Chicago, not just the city itself, but a Chicago collaborative created a 4-year digital inclusion plan. And in this plan is not only paying for connectivity, but it's also, they've identified community-based organizations that are necessary to do the digital literacy training and to do the outreach for that connectivity that has been covered both through CARES Act and through philanthropy. And they did that by creating a very simple application for community-based organizations. And mostly what they wanted to know is, who do you already serve? Doesn't matter if those community-based organizations did digital inclusion work or not, but those community-based organizations were already connected to the at-risk populations and trusted by them. Bingo, that's the deal, right? Because then they can be taught the digital inclusion part. And then they're able to reach out to folks and know that, okay, what I'm telling you is not a scam. It is for real. This is really internet that's been paid for by somebody else. So Chicago is, I think, a fabulous example because they intentionally included that community-based organization part up front. Detroit is an interesting example because a couple of years ago, the city of Detroit invested in staff. Started out with one person. They called him a digital inclusion manager. And then when COVID hit, they were really ready, because he'd already been developing relationships all throughout the city. He knew who all the partners were, and he'd already started to form a coalition. So then when COVID hit, he really ramped up creation of the coalition, was really able to raise millions of dollars for it, for the work, because there was that hinge point, which in Columbus has turned out to be the task force. This is what hinges us all together. And then Kansas City is an example because they started their coalition about, I'm going to say 6 years ago. I think it was about the same time NDIA got started. And so they really have that longevity of knowing who's who and what's going on. And so the city's involved, the library is a main partner, the local foundations are involved, all the community-based organizations. It's a really strong coalition that's able to pull folks together. Next slide. Okay, so those were the highs. Now let's talk about the realities. Bridging the digital divide is a challenge because not everybody is starting from the same set of understanding. The reality that is in the United States, the broadband ecosystem is a for-profit model. That's not a negative thing, it's just a fact, right? We don't have systems set up that make sure that everybody has access to broadband. That's nobody's job, essentially. And then when COVID hit, communities decided it was going to be their job to figure that out. So one of the challenges, though, is that because broadband in the United States is a commodity, we have to have very honest discussions about that fact and the fact that we have to figure out how to deal with that. Because yes, nobody wants to take another business down, right? Like, we appreciate the internet service providers that we have, but we at the same time have to figure out how to take care of our residents who don't have access because they can't afford it or because they don't have the digital literacy skills. So we always have to make sure we're wrapping them at the same time. The scale and impact of the digital divide is hard to measure and quantify. In part, that is because it's constantly changing, because technology keeps changing. We were on a task force meeting and I said that we would never solve the digital divide, and I about made Autumn cry, which was not my intention. I never want to make Autumn cry. But the reason I said that is because the technology is going to keep changing. So we're going to keep having new challenges in front of us. We might be able to get folks all access at 25.3 or even 100. We can set a goal and get everybody access at that particular speed. But if we're not always looking forward to the future, we're going to be playing catch up constantly. And the digital literacy skills is part of that. we will have to constantly be working on, which means it's investment. That's a continual investment. I know nobody wants to hear that, which is one of the reasons, frankly, I think a lot of philanthropy has avoided digital literacy issues in the past, because it is not a, okay, invest and walk away. There's no sustainability to that, right? We have to keep investing in it. Another big challenge with this issue is that, as mentioned, broadband is regulated lightly and regulated in different states differently. The federal government may disagree with a state on how they're going to regulate. It's kind of all over the place, and it depends upon whether the broadband is coming in through a cable or through a copper. Like, it really, whew, that's not good. So there's advocacy out there to fix that. And I think in coming up, because there's more awareness of this issue, again, thanks to COVID, we might actually get somewhere on those issues. But having this effort within Columbus be more aware of those and be able to, as Cleveland did, and Columbus did a similar letter, write letters to our elected officials and say, here's what's happening, right? Here's the facts, and here's the policies that we need change. That's essential. We do need a national plan. We don't have one. Our last broadband plan for the country was written in 2010. Things have changed a little bit since then. Last big point to make is that folks have been left behind, right? Understanding the value for someone who hasn't had access to the internet and knows what's possible, and then just thinking that we can, throw the internet at them and think that it's all going to work. It won't, right? That's the digital literacy part. That's making sure folks see the value, and it's not just for them, which is really incredible. It's for the community. Because if we have more folks using these tools, then our businesses can move more of their resources, their services online. Our governments can move more of their resources online, which is then saving money. So that means that's getting us at what some of those solutions are. Because if we have more of the industries that will benefit involved in funding the solutions, frankly, win-win. Alrighty, and I think we're at Q&A.
One more slide, last slide.
Last slide. Oh, sorry, I do have one more slide. This is Sam's famous educate, advocate, innovate, which I'll have you all know, I put on a little Post-it on my desk. Thank you, Sam, because I think that's brilliant. So educate, it's what we've just did with you all right now, right? Everyone needs to understand what the situation is so we can all go at it. And this task force is a small get things done kind of situation. We also need a broader coalition that is everybody's welcome, which other cities have, and we kind of had a tiny one starting for a while, and it didn't. There needs to be a home for a coalition, and it needs to be meeting regularly. The advocate part, which we've kind of wrapped through some of these slides, is that we do need to make sure that we are saying to our elected officials, this is what we need, because here's the reality in Columbus, Ohio. And innovate, right? Isn't this what we're known for in Columbus, for our innovation? We have to explore the new technologies. We have to explore those public-private partnerships. And as CM keeps telling us, we have to figure out what the business model is. Okay, I think now I'm done.
Thank you, Angela, Autumn, and Sam. We are now to the point of Q&A. I want to remind everyone, or not remind, I want to share, I learned that CTV has another taping at 5 o'clock, so we are going to need to end in about 25 minutes. So we'll be watching the time there. Questions from the committee?
Christy, this is Sandy Doyle Ahern. I have a real quick question. I think it's quick. So first of all, thank you for all the information. The one basic question I have is, maybe it's for Sam. Do you believe that the infrastructure is in place currently to meet the demand, the actual fiber, the actual lines, and so therefore we're focused more on access and providers, or do we still have an infrastructure gap?
So that's a great question. And regardless of the broadband technology, the point that I think you're making is what's critical to all of it is the fiber, because it all connects back to the fiber. And that's the really, really good news here. We have a plethora of fiber in Columbus and Franklin County. The city itself, we're not the only fiber provider in the region. There are many fiber providers in the county and in the region, but Columbus just itself has over 1,000 miles of fiber. And we probably should have showed you that fiber map, but it's maybe one of the most extensive fiber networks of municipalities in the country. And it literally, if you think of 270, we go all the way to Polaris. We cover the whole 270, 70. It literally is in every neighborhood in the city. So from the fiber aspect of it, which is quite considerable. A lot of cities don't have that, and their starting point is building the fiber. In our case, it's already been built. It's already there. It's there right now.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm probably the only one that would get geeked out by seeing that map, but I did ask specifically because I think it helps us understand for our future recommendations where we should be thinking about posing resources and our actions. So I appreciate that clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
Sandy, if I may, just real quick though, on to that point, the infrastructure's there. If we start to get, providers to provide more, more options, faster speeds, the things that we need especially in the communities that we see on all the maps, because it's the same map for everything. One of the challenges is, as housing affordability is not, as people continue to be housing burdened, and this is a statement to the committee, but also, I think this is something that we need to be thinking about because it ties back to our affordable housing. As people are housing burdened, they will not be able to afford luxuries, call it a luxury, like broadband, because they have to pay more than 30% of their income for rent. And so when you pay 30% or more of your income for rent, then it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs: food, clothes, car, transportation, bus pass, whatever your transportation is and the cost of that, heating, gas, electric, et cetera. And technology or broadband is kind of at the bottom. I didn't even add childcare in there. And so as we think about this, adoption rates will lag in those communities where people are housing burdened. And I didn't see adoption on the list, but adoption follows, right? Accessibility and affordability and all of that, because then you got to, and literacy, then you adopt the technology. But there is that connection in this community when we start to look at those maps, when we start to look at, where we're not seeing high adoption rates or where we're not seeing, people take advantage of the broadband that may be out there today. We have a community that is housing burdened and paying a lot of money for rent, and our rents continue to rise. And so I just want to raise that because that gets lost in this particular conversation. And I think, and there is a connection.
And then this is Tasha, Christy.
Michael, you're next.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. No. Tasha, you go, and then Michael, you're.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Sorry. So Autumn shared, and again, this was just an excellent presentation, and I learned a lot, particularly with the regions where broadband is not being accessed or there isn't access to it, which brings me to the point of kind of the timeline. So Autumn talked about that the PAC zone by 2025, I think she said, would have broadband. What's the timeline for some of the other regions, right? So, we're looking at like the Far East side, which has become a resource desert, where around, the former East Lamar area, you start getting out to, further kind of on the border of OBEX, and I started to see that the use dissipate out there as well. What's the timeline for kind of a more citywide adoption? And then the second part of my question is, what is the sustainability for a project like this? Because we know broadband changes almost every year, right? Like I just got to notice that I guess the highest internet access available to AT&T is now available, and it's every year they're updating that. So what's the plan to sustain this, in the future?
So this is Sam. I'll take that. Both great questions. Essentially, the timeline for the pilots, our expected go live is in January, and they're effectively the remainder of the current school year and pretty much next calendar year. So as Angela mentioned before, we're really looking for operational models, and so the financial component and really understanding the cost and how it would be potentially scaled then suggests that we have to find revenue sources, grant sources, and other funding mechanisms to scale these beyond these two pilots. And so that's going to be the critical next step. As we've described throughout the presentation, we believe there has to be alignment at a federal, state, and local level with the thinking, number one, and number two, the public policy that allows for these types of investments to incur either by municipalities, state government, or federal government. And then lastly, alignment with with the private sector. When we talk about the potential scale, we've got to have private sector participation because of the need to support all those citizens. So I'd love to tell you that there's clarity around really the next steps beyond these two pilots, but the pilots are the path forward to getting to the rest of the city. So we will be taking the kind of what we're going to learn from the pilots and then utilizing that to figure out what the long-term strategy is going to be. And then, certainly, I think many of us have an expectation that there's going to be a change in Washington, and there's been a lot of advocacy around the digital divide, not just here in Columbus, but at the state level. There's this conversation is occurring in rural Ohio as well, and it's occurring in other urban cities and other states. So I think we're hopeful that there'll be continued focus on this and a potential for federal stimulus and other types of things that would align with what we're doing, and therefore these models these pilots then become things that we can scale. We've got solutions should those things occur. All right. Hope that answered your question.
Next, Michael.
Yes, thank you. Quickly, and Sam, this may go to you, or I'm not sure. Tasha's, when you answer that question, kind of answered a lot of my points in there. But I know there is a firm that I think is a consultant that works with the city currently, or has for a while, with the fiber network. And I know we do own one of the larger fiber networks in the city, in addition to companies like Crown Castle and a few others that as third-party companies. And I can't remember the name of it. I've seen it on some websites before. Are you familiar with that company, and are they engaged in any of this part of the process at all that you're aware of?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't right away. It doesn't click in terms of who it might be.
Okay.
I mean, we do the city owns the fiber, but we utilize a variety of firms in the market to actually construct it and maintain it for us. So Gudenkauf, Harrison Hefner, Fischl are three examples of companies that we work with in the construction and the maintenance of the fiber.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just curious. There's another firm I'll have to look up as far as their involvement in doing some things with that. And I know the big problem here is in the last mile, so to speak, and getting service to folks where we can own a lot of the network and be in control of it, but it's the last mile relationships with whatever provider it might be that is the issue in getting it to a lot of folks as well, and from a cost perspective.
Michael, that's exactly right. And I would just emphasize the two pilots in the last mile are wireless.
Okay.
So we're essentially taking radios and putting them on the top of buildings and connecting the radios to the city's fiber for the backhaul portion.
Great.
So it does kind of go right at that last mile cost component.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'd work a lot in the telecom industry and have been around that for a long time. So always love to hear more about that and be part of that in the future as we go on. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Hi, Sam, this is Tony Cunningham. How are you?
Hi, Tony.
Hi. I was just wondering if there's also a company that I'm familiar with that has a new technology called Paint on Fiber to do the last mile fiber as well, where you don't have to disrupt the environment in order to get the fiber to the home. I didn't know if you were familiar with that company or if I could help make some connection there, because it's a less expensive way. And it's also, we're looking at it to create a new workforce around it, because there's training and folks that need to be hired in order to do this type of work. And so happy to make a connection there as well, to just start some conversations to see if that's worth pursuing.
We're certainly open to all options, and while the pilots have been selected around wireless, would love to learn about that other alternative. So let's connect.
Okay.
Angela, this question is for you. In the Detroit build out, are they using traditional providers, or do they have kind of a mix of non-traditional and traditional?
So the different examples I gave you were all wildly different. So what's happening in Detroit is they're still figuring out that connectivity piece. They have their short term, they focused on the short term, which is the same thing we did, which is buying the hotspots and buying wireline and bulk purchasing. But they don't currently, at least it's not public. A lot of times these efforts are underground until they're ready to go public. They haven't expressed, because the other important thing is that they have Rocket Fiber. So they already have a new company that's come in, and they've been in there for at least 4 or 5 years now, that has already been, as one might say, disrupting the market. They have additional competition. Around here, we have WOW, but they're not really expanding.
Yeah.
Like Rocket Fiber is expanding there. A critique of Rocket Fiber, though, is that because it is a for-profit venture, it has gone to the wealthier neighborhoods first, which is a legitimate critique, right? And that's exactly what we're trying to solve here, is that it then doesn't reduce the cost. Although I want to make sure to clarify that the competition might reduce the cost for to a rate that is more reasonable for middle income folks, but competition alone will not lower, unless we got to, like, there's a town in Utah that has 10 providers because they have an open access network, and they really do have really cheap broadband. But for most places, it's bringing in 1 or 2 more providers isn't going to make it more affordable for a low income family, which as Autumn had noted in their survey, and this is true amongst in the other research that we've seen out there, the affordable rate is sometimes, for some folks, it's free. For some folks, there's no other option unless someone is subsidizing it completely for them. And for others, they're like, yeah, we can do $10, $15 a month.
Yeah, and Rocket Fiber is, just so that everybody knows, it's a Dan Gilbert company. That's, that's Detroit, right? So we're not likely to see, I mean, who knows, but you're not likely to see something like that all of a sudden come into our market, because their local billionaire, he needs fiber for his businesses, so he just started a company. One of my questions also is, I know we've got the pilots, and obviously the pilots, the scale, can be a problem. And if we're trying to, we think about, trying to move more quickly or get to some of the neighborhoods that when we saw on the map and that Tasha mentioned, what is it going to take to get the large companies to start playing ball and to, bring more resources to bear, participate in, really a robust digital inclusion effort, bring more CapEx in the market? I mean, what do you think it's going to take? And that, I throw it out to anyone. Be honest, Angela.
It's for the existing internet service providers, it's about the profit margin. they can't get is there. In fact, if we go look, where has fiber been deployed in Columbus by, I can do this because I don't work for the city and I work nationally, by AT&T. Small, more wealthier neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods.
Yep.
Right? That's because that's where they make their money back. So if we want to solve this problem, I don't see how we solve it by pleading, because that's really, we've already done a lot of pleading all across the country. And I'm not just talking about Columbus. There's been a lot of pleading going on, right? Because the need is so great. But this is where looking at these alternative solutions, like bringing in partners, just as is happening with these 2 pilots, that's really how we get at some solutions. Even, and I think it's important to bring up the discount offers of the existing providers that we have, because they are valuable, but they're also very limiting.
Yeah.
Right? So only certain populations are eligible. If you have previous debt, or you currently have service, or you recently have service, you are ineligible. And we all know when you're struggling financially, you'll pay for some things, then you won't pay for something else. So it's very common for a family, they have broadband this month. Oh, now that we've racked up some debt there, then we'll switch to somebody else. Oh no, we racked up some debt there. Oh, now we can't go anywhere because we have debt with everybody. So then they're just stuck. And so the on and off with providers, it means that we have to figure out a solution that really gets at that affordability. And we really have to put the community first, which is just not how our current broadband ecosystem works.
Christy, I'd throw one addition to that comment out, and it's a broad statement, and it's the statement around, I think, what was discussed early on in the discussion, that unfortunately this is still treated as a luxury item and not as a utility, a right, so, and unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen in this country anytime soon, although there is certainly a movement to push it to be something more that everybody has access to, as opposed to a luxury. And it feels to me like the solutions in the short term have to suggest that it's going to continue to be viewed as a luxury. I would hope in the next decade, and I'm throwing out a number, that we shift into the world of recognizing that this is how we operate now, and everyone has a right to this utility. But our solutions, I think, today can't assume that will happen, because it is a profit-based business, as is being mentioned right now. Something we could probably talk about as a group later on too.
And
Hey, Christy.
I also wonder, just piggybacking off what Sandy said, at Columbus State, we can draw an absolute direct line to what's happened in COVID and the digital divide, and adults and traditional students, but particularly our adult students, especially in the zip codes and the census tracts that we looked at today, that dropped out. And that is an economic impact in our community. That is a direct line to workforce, to community resiliency, to community sustainability. And so there's data that we have within this community that we can bring to bear in this, because we are foreclosing, because of this situation, we are foreclosing people out of being part of our economy. And that is a direct industry impact. So as we're trying to make the case, it feels like we can make this case across multiple dimensions.
Yeah, thank you. Keith?
Yeah, Christy, is Sam still on?
I think so. Sam?
I am.
I had a question. Sam, Keith Stevens, PSI. It's been a long time since we met, but my question is for you. I've been following Elon Musk and what he's doing with SpaceX and the Starlink project, launching broadband satellites. There's 700 that have been launched with a goal of putting 30,000 more into orbit, specifically to provide broadband to those that can't afford it or get it now. I don't know if you've been reading that, but potentially, what are the long-term implications? I would think it's going to impact the fiber providers, could drive costs down. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, certainly, thanks for bringing that up. Certainly following that as an option. They're still in beta phase, and it's a bold plan and a bold vision, as generally we have with Elon. I think we have to see how it's going to work. I know that some of the introductory speeds are slower than where they plan to be long term, and they do have to scale that technology out across America. So I'm with you. I think it's an alternative uh, internet service offering, and certainly we're hopeful that they'll be able to provide faster speeds at the type of affordable options that we need, and that will be part of the mix going forward. As Angela indicated before, for some of our families, affordable is free, and I think we've got to figure that part out as well.
By the way, great presentation from the panelists. Very good content.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to get those slides, correct? I think I saw that. Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Hey, Christy, can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hi, Sam, I think this might be a question more for you. My name is Gina again. I'm from Columbus Early Learning Centers. I know that the last mile issue is a pretty significant issue, and I wanted to know if you had information on, one, the reliability of trying to close the digital divide with wireless, and the reliability of the wireless versus having it via broadband or fiber. And then second of all, based on the neighborhoods, it's like the providers have said, oh, we'll only cover this neighborhood, or we'll cover that neighborhood, or and there's not the ability to kind of have any competition to help drive down the price. Could you maybe speak to that? I mean, and even for the businesses that are trying to serve the community, for example, our building on Broad Street, half of the building is served by Spectrum, the other half of the building is served by WOW. So we have to have two internet providers going into the building to serve our classrooms. So is there any talk with the providers about overlapping communities and helping to try to drive down that cost in some of the lower income communities, because some of them won't even operate in those specific communities, so you only have one choice and they can choose whatever the pricing is?
So I'm going to try and tackle those quickly because we've got about 11 minutes to go. So first of all, the fiber versus wireless. So fiber we would consider wireline, and so that would be extending the fiber to the residence or a business even. That is always going to be preferable over wireless. Wireline technology, especially fiber optics, always going to be faster, and it's always going to be more future-proofed. Right now, it's also the most expensive. And so I don't have those numbers in front of me, but just rough rule of thumb, the last mile build out per household just for the fiber connection is around $2,000. Wireless, it's a hundredth that. Now, the good news on the wireless side, and if we think about residential broadband connectivity, it's primarily been wireline, not fiber to the home, but fiber in the backbone and then coax to the home. The good news is the wireless technologies are changing. In fact, two of the technologies we're piloting are new technologies, and they do provide higher capacity. They're both based on 5G. One is known as CBRS, and the other is dense millimeter wave. And we do expect to see much higher throughput than you would get on your cell phone. So they tend to be point to point, and that's part of what we're testing, because they are new technologies and we have to see where they work. So we're certainly hopeful, and like I said earlier, we're going to learn a lot. To your next question, I don't know that we've done a lot of mapping of where the existing broadband providers are providing service down to a neighborhood level. I think that's a really good notion, and that's a big takeaway for me on something we ought to really do, and we ought to know more discreetly where they are and where they're not. And I'm going to take that as an action item. In your particular case, where you've got a building with one provider on one side and another provider on the other, I'd love to talk to you about that, because I think I might have some options for you on how to maybe fix that. So maybe we can talk after.
Yeah, some of that is legacy cable franchise agreement.
Right.
You know, where the cable providers were able to operate. So that's probably why there's some of that weirdness out there. But a mapping would be good. It's hard to get the you know, the ISPs to tell you exactly where they are because of the competitive nature of the work. But to the extent that we could get it or figure it out, it would be interesting to have. And Angela has done some of that work, actually. At least I know in Cleveland, you did a pretty good job in Cleveland, at least mapping where they weren't to show you know, effectively to show the redlining. I remember that. So I want to stop there because we have to end a few minutes early today so that CTV can get ready for their next session. But as always, to the panelists, we want to thank you. It was a great presentation. Thank you for sharing your slides. We like to say that you get, we get the right to ask you to come back or ask questions or you know, when we get into our second phase where we're going to be in groups and we need to take a deeper dive, and especially as things are changing, we may want to come back to you to learn about the pilots because our work's going to continue on for a while. Hannah is capturing the chat for everyone, so she will send out some of the emails and some of the information that's being put into the chat. And I want to thank everyone on the advisory committee for being here today. Look forward to seeing you next week. And thank our panelists again, and we will give this channel over to CTV. Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Great. Thank you. Take care.